So, Bronson, I'm curious, after looking at all this data, what has been some of your biggest takeaways when it comes to specifically the bedding and the movement of these bucks in between these bedding areas and bedding sites?
Something we haven't shown here, and I kind of want to use a similar amount of rigor for this. Back again, I mentioned Natasha a moment ago. Is we're kind of doing some of the same type of analyses though with food plots, and just very much in general here. A, a really good productive food plot, when you look at one of those and you look at all the deer movements going on around it, they're an anchor. They are an anchor point on the landscape, meaning that at any given minute of any day, it does not mean a deer is going to be right on it or just adjacent to it. But when you start looking at day by day, week by week, that is one of the most popular places on the landscape, and it makes perfect sense. But where deer are focused. And so I'm not saying, because we were poking fun a little bit earlier about just parking it right on the food plot, that's not the thing to do. But start thinking about where is that food plot, that really high productive food plot? Where are some areas like we're looking at here that would be, in general, some of these great cover areas, and hunting corridors? I mean, that has probably been the biggest thing for me, is how to hunt these corridors. Another little thing about food plots we're going to cover more in the future is, what do you think the ideal size of a food plot is relative to buck visitation?
Oh, probably
Half an acre.
So let me give you one more qualifier.
shape.
On
Oh,
this landscape, we had anywhere from half an acre food plots all the way up to 20-acre. Is it even a food plot or a field then? But we have a lot of examples of really small ones in between and really big, and there was a clear trend of where they went most often.
I feel like it'd be small, but also maybe just food plots they can get to where there's a visual obstruction where like maybe it's a low spot, even if it's a bigger food plot, there's a low corner they can come out to where visually they can kind of see out, but they can't be seen as easy. That's just kind of my take on it. I don't know.
We didn't look at that.
Okay.
So that could be something, looking at the characteristics around it, but we just looked at size. Is there a sweet spot for which ones are they going to visit more? And it was 4 acres. So there was a nice little bell curve that was centered right on 4 acres, a little less for 5, a little less for 3. But essentially, it was obviously very diminishing returns after 4 acres. So meaning that 5 is not better than 4, 6 is not better than 4. Once you get to about 4 acres, you're going to get all you're going to get out of that. And so, if you're a manager, if I've got the resources and I'm going to allocate to food plot, do you do 10 little 1 acre food plots? Do you do 2 4 acres? You don't need to do a 10 plus acre. And so I thought that was really, really interesting.
That is.
That is, and it makes you wonder because of that size. Like I just hypothesize, or I can't talk here.
Up, 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 up.
Theorizing here that maybe it's one of those things that it's large enough, and depending again, I also feel like the size and shape and where a buck can enter could also play a factor, but also it's big enough when he gets out there. It's not like a coyote or something could ambush him from a very close. Because you start talking about those really small food plots, which I think a lot of people talk about kill plots and stuff like that being like a big factor for like maybe close to a bedding site. But if it's a buck getting out in that little opening and it's super thick and brushy around it, that's that much closer predator could get to him without him noticing. Versus if he's in a slightly more open food plot that still has some good cover around it, maybe he feels more secure and something like that. That's really interesting.
Well, and this is us hypothesizing as well. It's really hard to test something like this, but we came up with 2 that we thought had a lot of weight. One, food plots are also social for bucks. I mean, they're going to these different places because does are there. They're heat checking. They're not spending a lot of time eating during the rut. They're there for a few minutes and they're off. Now, what would draw more deer is what are going to draw more does is you having a lot of high quality forage. And so a 1/4 acre food plot is going to get eaten down lip high pretty soon But when you start getting into this 3, 4, 5, you grow a lot more forage. And then it was just kind of diminishing returns after that. So I think it's just greater sunlight, greater amount of area, more biomass production draws in more females, and that's going to draw in more bucks.
Excellent point. Also, do you think there's a correlation between food plot use, as in with a relative distance to bedding cover, and also some of these travel corridors?
Certainly. I mean, the better situation you have for more good, secure travel corridors to a plot, during daylight especially, I could see there being greater use. And we actually looked at what is the average distance away a buck is bedded from one of these food plots. And there's another very clear signal of about 200 yards. Some of them would be 100, some of them would be 3 or 4. We had some that would be up to 1,200 yards away. But when you look at the frequency distribution, the most common distance was around 200 yards.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Another management opportunity, if on a landscape, I'm going to make sure I have some bedding cover within 200 yards of a food plot, and I'm going to put a stand about 100 yards in between the plot and the cover.
On a natural travel corridor, or build a travel corridor right there. Interesting.
And one term you used a second ago that really caught my attention was the term anchor, like that food plot is acting as an anchor. Would you apply that term to anything else? Like, could really good cover act as an anchor as well? Or is it just like a big destination feed source that you would reserve that term for?
I think a lot of things could be an anchor, but I think it is based on the quality of the resource relative to what the landscape is offering. So where we started, a cover plot in the Midwest, that's an anchor point because it is so uniquely different. It is offering something that 90+% of the landscape is not. I think it could be a hardwood flat or hillside where you got a high density of white oaks or red oaks. Yeah, I think that's going to be an anchor spot. So I think it can be cover as well as food as well as a travel corridor.
Okay, that is super interesting, and that's something that I kind of latch onto because it's so practical for taking this information and actually going and using it in the field. Like now, you could go look at your local piece of public, or you could go look at your hunting club or your lease and say, like, do I have an anchor? Or what is my anchor on this property, and to kind of start thinking about it through that lens. It's very interesting. And also on this map right here, we got all these blue dots on it, all these bedding sites, where he's definitely got some little focal areas that it seems like he really prefers. But from a hunting standpoint, what you're really looking for is you're looking for where all those white lines are stacking up on each other and kind of spider webbing out. And over on the far eastern side of this map, it kind of seems like that's where you'd want to be, like just the amount of time that he's spending crisscrossing through there. Now, I don't know how much that is daytime versus nighttime, so that's a caveat. But it looks like he's going over there and hitting some fields.
Yeah, it looks like you got a pretty good density of food plots right there on the east side as well.
Yeah.
Kind of anchoring
Kinda
some
like an
movement,
anchor.
huh? Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, and he liked that little piece of the river. Yeah, that I think this is the map that got everyone fired up, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And again, where I think most people were getting fired about it, not understanding exactly the terminology being used during like early rut and just all the different stages of rut. Because again, we're talking about a 10-week period of time. This is a 2-week period of time, but it's still that early December time period when typically peak breeding in this area is going to be around Christmas. You said kind of like late December time period. So it's still applicable because the thing is, the way I would analyze a lot of this data is just depending on where your rut is. Like if you're in South Alabama and your rut's not until say Martin Luther King Day, January 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, something like that, you're just moving this all back a little bit. I mean,
exactly.
It's that simple, kind of moving this kind of data around and kind of figuring out exactly kind of what it's going to look like, movement wise for you. So that is super interesting. But also, one thing that I'm always fascinated with is, again, how bucks are using the landscape for traveling. And it seemed like one thing you brought up earlier, I want you to kind of define this, is they're using a lot of travel corridors. And I don't know if that might have been the exact term you called it. But what would you describe what these, say, corridors look like that a buck's going to use in order to travel from point A to point B?
have not put a pencil to paper on this yet, but my prediction, and that would be really difficult to characterize because we can go to a bedding site and it's a very defined space and we can take some measurements. When you start looking at a movement pathway or a corridor, you got to take a lot of measurements and so forth. I would envision or the way I think about it in my weird way, is that a buck stands up and he's ready to move north, west, east, south, whatever, he's probably locking in on some feature on the landscape to provide screening cover in that general direction. And I think that could be grass. I think it could be trees. I think it could be blackberry. So I think it could come in so many different forms. Maybe where y'all hunt, it might even be more topography. So it might be going down into the creek bed and navigating that way. But that's kind of the way I think about it. I really don't have it quantified or defined, but I would just say any way that the buck can navigate from point A to point B where he is obscuring himself the best way possible.
Do you have any examples, or maybe some spots that you hunt of some natural travel corridors that you really like, or examples from places that you've hunted before?
Yeah, and probably the most often it would be looking at adjacent to creeks. And so when you have, whether it be in pine country or hardwoods, but just a lot of times you will see the density of cover be greater closer to water. And it might be, again, it could be switch cane, it could be privet or something like that. But I could easily envision that when you're looking at this in front of you and a deer's going to move through here, well, it's not going to move through that wide open space there. It's not going to move through that wide open. It's going to be tiptoeing adjacent to this creek. And at least on one side, it has security cover that it can jump into. Now, I say that not having a single 180 on the wall.
Neither do we. So.
This is me spending time in the woods, taking this and looking and just trying to think it through. So, but yeah, I don't have taxidermy to prove that.